Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I am your host, Stephen Peinecker, and I'm just so excited to have my next guest here. We just talked not that long ago for part one of our conversation, where Mr. Thomas Murphy, anthropologist, came on to talk about his adventures amongst the evangelicals, and we had a fun conversation. Thomas, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's great to be here again. I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Snohomish people, one of the Coast Salish nations of Western Washington and Western British Columbia. And it's a privilege to engage in a little book review.
Yes, this is going to be an interesting episode because we're going to be kind of doing like a presentation and a running book review, which should be fun. Now, as I had told you last time, Thomas was going to come on to address Rod Meldrum after he would make his appearance on my program and give his presentation about the Heartland Model. And so I gave him the opportunity to make his presentation, and then Thomas watched the program and then prepared his notes. And then we decided that we're going to now film this response to it, which I think is in the spirit of this program. We want to do more of a civil conversation. And that's really important to Thomas. And so that's what we're going to have. We're going to have a civil conversation about a subject that many people, for whatever reason, in particular, the Heartland Model seems to bring out a lot of passion in people. And I think it's just time that we start talking and maybe have a more civil dialogue. So Thomas, why don't we just hop right into it, man? You're titling this "An Anthropologist Reviews the Heartland Model." So, Mr. Anthropologist, let's review it.
Yeah, so the way I would like to frame this discussion is as kind of a book review of three books. The first of those would be Rod Meldrum's Rediscovering the Book of Mormon Remnant Through DNA, which is a response to that video we discussed in our last interview, DNA versus the Book of Mormon. Doesn't engage quite as much the Bible versus the Book of Mormon, but that would actually help if they had. But the second book that I want to look at is Rod Meldrum's Exploring the Book of Mormon in America's Heartland. And the third is Jonathan Neville's Moroni's America, the North American setting for the Book of Mormon. And so kind of a collective review of these three books is the approach that I'd like to take.
Well, sounds good.
I want to begin with a kind of the things I find valuable in these works, or my positive analysis. And I begin with the kind of the aesthetics, especially of this book, the photographic book. It's just a beautiful book. It's a great coffee table book, ironically, for Mormons. But it's great for that in terms of the pictures that are there and the layout and the display. It's beautiful. And my second positive evaluation is a very general one. And it's that I really appreciate the way that these three books are helping to change the narrative about the Book of Mormon. And they have rejected the view that I grew up with, that Lamanites are the principal ancestors of the American Indians. Now, in 1981, that perspective was actually incorporated into the Book of Mormon, into the introduction of the Book of Mormon, and was part of what I grew up with reading, was that Lamanites were the principal ancestors of the American Indians. That view, of course, ran into trouble with the rise of genetic research. And when Simon Southerton and I began publishing on DNA in the Book of Mormon, the church had to reevaluate its perspective. And our publications were probably not as impactful as that video we discussed from Living Hope Ministries, DNA versus the Book of Mormon, which really reached a much broader audience, millions of people, as we discussed, to raise the profile of this problem. And so, for most of Latter-day Saint history, the default assumption was that the Book of Mormon described the origins of all American Indians from North and South America, what's often called a hemispheric model. And that was sort of the default assumption that was at one time even incorporated into the footnotes of the Book of Mormon in the 1879 and 1911 editions, where Orson Pratt had inscribed a hemispheric geography into the text itself. And that's where there's kind of an interesting, I think, a strength, but also a little bit, it could be stronger. And that is that the Heartland model is, in contrast to the other dominant model in Mormon thought, which is the Mesoamerican model, that had begun to replace the hemispheric model. Actually, it first appeared in the early 20th century in what the RLDS Church would, the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that would eventually become the Community of Christ. That's where a more limited geography with a Mesoamerican setting first appeared. And it didn't get a lot of traction in LDS circles. Some discussion in the 50s and 60s, but it really wasn't until the 80s that it really got a lot of traction in the LDS Church with a Ensign publication by John Sorensen, for example. But despite the fact that it was rising, that Mesoamerican model was rising, that at the same time there was kind of a dual message coming from the church. The same time that they had this cautious embrace of the Mesoamerican model, they changed the introduction to the Book of Mormon to be more defensive of a hemispheric model. And so that tension was playing out until the DNA research came to the fore, and that the DNA research just obliterated the hemispheric model, and demonstrated that it absolutely just can't be true. And so the church had to come up with a new approach. So the LDS Church's response in the early 2000s was in 2007, and then into 2013, they edited the introduction to the Book of Mormon to take out that principal, and the Lamanites were the principal ancestors of the American Indians, to say they were among the ancestors of American Indians. And so that was done in 2007 in the Doubleday edition of the Book of Mormon, and then 2013 in the main LDS edition of the Book of Mormon. And so what these three books do is contribute to that dialogue by introducing, instead of a Mesoamerican limited geography, a North American limited geography, to propose that because we know that nearly all Native Americans can find their closest relatives in North Asia, that they couldn't have come from the ancient Near East, or as the Book of Mormon seemed to describe for generations of Mormons. And so this is really the most prominent now articulation of a limited geography for the Book of Mormon within North America.
So I just want to go back a little bit, because you had I was under the impression that the Mesoamerica model became pretty dominant earlier than the 80s, only because you had the Tria Life Stella, and you also had Ferguson making the expedition down to find the Book of Mormon lands. I was under the impression that they were kind of pinpointing Mesoamerica like by the 1940s or 50s, that was starting to move in that direction.
You had Milton Hunter, for example, and stuff that was writing at that time, but they were in the sense that they were considering Mesoamerica, but they weren't articulating as clearly a limited geography.
Got it.
So they were considering a Mesoamerican setting, yes, but that wasn't necessarily exclusive of a North American setting.
Got it.
And so that over time, that exclusivity grew, and that when I pinpoint the 80s, what I'm pinpointing is the willingness of the church to take these ideas that have been circulating in scholarly circles and put them in an official church publication, the Ensign.
Got it.
That's what happened in the 80s, but it was a multi-decade movement, okay? And so you're right to point out that there were discussions occurring much earlier, but they were primarily in the scholarly community rather than in the official organs of the church.
Okay, interesting. Well, let's continue on.
Yeah, and so what this Heartland model does that I think is critical for the furthering of Book of Mormon studies is that it draws attention back to the original setting of the Book of Mormon. And what I mean by the original setting, where the Book of Mormon came from. And we often frame that in terms of coming from Palmyra, New York, or Manchester, or Hill Cumorah, you know, in terms of using what I would call colonial geography. Another way to frame that is that the Book of Mormon came from Seneca territory, Seneca being one of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois. And so if we place it more in indigenous geography, the Book of Mormon came from a very specific place. And so they're trying to shift that perspective back to that place. And that's important because it is actually more consistent with the historical record and the development of ideas within Mormonism. And so the earliest readers of the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith's contemporaries, they saw the Book of Mormon very much in terms of their experience in Western New York and in Ohio and Illinois later. And actually, after the LDS got out to Utah, they also read the Book of Mormon very much within the context of Utah's indigenous nations. And so it kind of reshifts the focus by pushing back towards that place where the Book of Mormon actually came from. So in that respect, when we contrast the Heartland model with the Mesoamerican model, the Heartland model is more true to the historical sources. And so the Mesoamerican model has to, it has to kind of reinvent the story. And they try to do that by some references in early church periodicals to John Lloyd Stevens' work on Mesoamerica. And Jonathan Neville in particular pushes back on that by trying to look at it within the context of that early documentation. And he provides some evidence that Joseph Smith himself might have been reticent to fully embrace a Mesoamerican setting in the way that other editors of church magazines were. So that's an interesting contribution to the discussion. And what I see, again, as valuable is that when we look at the Book of Mormon in contrast to the archaeology of North America and the archaeology of Mesoamerica, and I'm one of the few people that have the good fortune of being able to participate in anthropological fieldwork in both settings, is that the descriptions of earthworks and fortifications in the Book of Mormon are actually much more consistent with the archaeology of North America than of Central America. And so drawing attention to that fact is an important contribution of these 3 books. And they point out that the images that I used to read and see, there used to be pictures in some of the editions of the LDS Church's editions of the Book of Mormon that had Mayan and other Central American ruins, and they point out that these classic Maya ruins that not only appeared in the Book of Mormon, but also appear in a lot of the literature of the Mesoamerican advocates are from the classic Maya period, which is actually much later than the Book of Mormon.
So just real quick,
And
the Temple of the Cross, as they entitle it, is this
yeah,
later Mayan, as you were describing?
yeah. So many of those images are from a later Mayan period. I'd have to look up that specific one
Okay, and
to
this is
be sure.
from this classic
Yeah,
blue Book of Mormon has Mesoamerica, also has a Machu Picchu in here as well. So
yeah. And so I think it's important to draw that attention to the timing of the classic Maya is actually a post Book of Mormon process, and so they do a good job of pointing that out. I agree with advocates of the Heartland model that the Book of Mormon's narrative and its prophecies do not support the genetic dilution argument proposed by Mesoamerican advocates and by the LDS Church's essay on the Book of Mormon. And I think this needs a little picking apart to help your audience understand. So after Simon and I published this research on DNA in the Book of Mormon, a number of folks from BYU and farms, I began publishing some responses suggesting that, well, yeah, we acknowledge that there's no evidence of an ancient Near Eastern connection among living American Indians, but it's possible that there once was such a connection and that that connection has been lost over time. That's essentially the position taken by the church's essay, which was its original version was authored by Ugo Perego and an Italian geneticist who worked in Utah. And this viewpoint is problematic in some key ways, in that the Book of Mormon is very literal and detailed about seed and about the passing on of genetic inheritance, although it doesn't use the word genetic inheritance, use the term seed, right? And the descendant populations of the Book of Mormon that the prophecies are about are prophesied to live into today's time and to the end of time. And that idea that the genetic traces of the Lehite, Mulekite, and Jaredite parties would have disappeared is inconsistent with the prophecies and the narrative of the Book of Mormon. And so I think the Heartland advocates are right on target here, is that that's a fundamental flaw of the Mesoamerican model and of the LDS Church's essay. I would agree with the Heartland advocates that North America is more fruitful ground for understanding the Book of Mormon. But I agree with it for somewhat different reasons. And I think that my focus is much more on the indigenous narratives in terms of what were Haudenosaunee, Seneca, and Oneida, and Mohegan and Mohican authors and spokespersons. What were they saying and at that time? And I think that reading the Book of Mormon within the context of 19th century America is critical. And I would point out that this is really where a lot of the best work in Mormon studies is occurring today, is looking at the Book of Mormon within that 19th century context. And it's being done by people at BYU, as well as by scholars outside of Mormonism. Some are even non-Mormons. And they're coming together around an important understanding. And that understanding is that whether you take the Book of Mormon as history or scripture or allegory, whatever your approach is, that the Book of Mormon speaks to a specific audience. And that specific audience is 19th century America. So if you want to understand the Book of Mormon, you need to understand 19th century America, no matter what your position on the historicity of the text is.
And I just want to interject that, one of the things that I've been talking about is I've been having this dialogue, is when scholars, biblical scholars, look at the scriptures, the most important audience is what's called the reception history, and the most
Right.
important audience is the audience that received the text first. I care more about what the Colossians and the Corinthians actually thought of the letters that they received and how they interpreted it, rather than a pope in 500 AD.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I look at it, is I look at that initial audience. And I've made this comparison before, Brigham Young and Sidney Rigdon, they get their scripture, they get their Book of Mormon, and they look at it, and they look at the mounds, and they say that's the history of those people. And that's
Mhm.
crucial to the very beginning of Mormonism. If there's, I look at it this way: no Native American mounds, no Book of Mormon.
Right. And the thing that I really like to see, because I think that the Heartland advocates here, Meldrum and Neville, for example, are making important contributions here. But what I don't see is a dialogue with the people, say, that are the scholars in the academy that are behind books like Producing Ancient Scripture, that was published by University of Utah Press, or Americanist Approaches to the Book of Mormon by Oxford University Press, that are looking at that 19th century text. There's not a lot of dialogue occurring between the Heartland folks and the people in the academy. And I'd like to see more of that. And hopefully this interview helps to facilitate that. Another thing I'd like to compliment the firm foundation that's behind the Heartland model on is their willingness to invite Native American speakers to their events. And I think in this respect, they're doing a better job than the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies did, or the Interpreter Foundation is doing now, the advocates of the Mesoamerican model. I would like to see a greater diversity of Native voices, rather than just Native people who believe similarly to what Meldrum and Neville think. I think that the dialogue would be increased by, and the insights would be increased by inviting more diverse Native voices. And then particularly, I'd like to encourage Native Christian voices, because Native Christians are wrestling with some of the same questions that come out in the Book of Mormon. Like, what is Jesus's relationship with Native Americans? And that question, there's an opportunity for dialogue here that I'd like to see more of. And kind of my final strength that I want to emphasize is really coming as much from your interview of Jonathan Neville as the texts themselves. And in your interview with him, he expressed more clearly than he does in the text his idea of multiple operating hypotheses. Rather than seeing himself as just an advocate of the Heartland model, he's open to seeing himself as an advocate of multiple models. Here's one that needs to be considered alongside others. Now, he wasn't as articulate about what are those other alternative hypotheses. And I'm going to give one at the end of this interview that I think needs greater consideration. But I think the spirit of this idea of multiple operating hypotheses is a great one, and one that needs to be encouraged. It also leads me to wonder about something very specific. And that is, I wonder how Neville would compare and contrast his perspective of multiple operating hypotheses with that of the Taos Pueblo scholar P. Jane Hafen, who writes a somewhat similar idea in the afterword of this book, Decolonizing Mormonism. What Jane Hafen advocates is that we take more seriously in Book of Mormon studies indeterminate versus determinate views of origins. An indeterminate view, which is common in indigenous communities, allows for multiple origin stories and recognizes that the stories are a means to an end. They're a teaching tool. They're not the end itself. And so that the stories don't have to be literally true to be to teach an important lesson, okay, to teach a religious principle or concept or idea, and or even an ecological idea, for example, which many do. And this approach also has a very important role in diplomacy. And I want to, I talk about that in this book as well. I have an essay in this book about my experiences traveling on tribal canoe journey. For over a decade, I've been traveling with Coast Salish nations on this annual pilgrimage where we go from our home locations to a First Nation or Native American tribes reservation or historic site that we converge on every year, and that kind of moves around. We've had many sites here in the U.S. and many up in Canada, and the one I write about in here is really a trip to Bella Bella, which is from where I'm at almost halfway to Alaska, and we're paddling about 500 miles in these canoes, and as we go along, more tribal nations join us. We spend the night at a tribe or First Nations homeland. They feed us, take care of us, and then share their stories, and we share our stories and songs with them. And we progressively get a larger and larger group until we converge on that final destination where we have a big potlatch, a whole gifting of material items as well as cultural items, things like crafts that have been made, and things like songs and dances and stories. And in this setting, this diplomatic setting, the stories that are shared by the guests are not viewed as in conflict as those shared by the host, even though they may differ in detail. And so there's a tolerance for different perspectives that, when you're in somebody else's land, you give deference to their story, but when they're in your land, they give deference to your story, and both are treated as equally valid and equally true. And that's a very different approach than Mormons typically apply to the Book of Mormon, where they often treat it in a very colonizing manner as if it's the one and only true history of ancient America. And Jane Hafen is trying to articulate an indeterminate model that I think should be in dialogue with Neville's multiple operating hypotheses. Another interesting result of an indeterminate approach is that it allows for both scientific and cultural explanations of origins, and it doesn't require that one exclude the other. It also provides a space for the recognition of allegory, of metaphor and parable, rather than taking everything literally.
It sounds to me that we could learn a lot about our society could learn a lot about maybe taking these approaches. That's kind of what I'm trying to do with the channel. I kind of accidentally stumbled into that, but I think that's kind of important. Yeah.
And the one last thing I would point out about Jane Hafen's argument is that she points out the determinate views that insist upon one and only one true story are the types that lend themselves to racism and nationalism. And that leads to some of my critiques, if you will, of the Heartland model. Oh, wait, I looking at my outline here, I realized I left out a couple of positive analysis. So let me come back to those.
Cool.
I agree with Neville that translators are limited to the language they understand. And I find his argument about Jonathan Edwards and Joseph Smith's relationship with Jonathan Edwards, probably he argues that Jonathan Edwards or Joseph Smith would have read Jonathan Edwards. It's also possible that he heard a lot of sermons based upon Jonathan Edwards and heard this orally. But basically you see Joseph Smith adopting the language and terminology of Jonathan Edwards in his translation or dictation of the Book of Mormon. And that's fascinating work. And I think it's a valuable contribution to the field of Mormon studies. And I would expand it beyond what Neville does, and we'll talk about that later. And lastly, I want to emphasize that I too value religion over science. But when I say that, I think I mean something very different than Meldrum articulated in his recent interview with you. Okay, I do not mean that I reject science when the stories from religion are different from the stories that scientists come up with. What I mean, and again, I would say, when I see stories as a means to an end, okay, and I would put scripture within that category of stories, okay, that scripture, teachings, songs, parables, all these things, they're a means for teaching values. And we can get caught up in too much in the details of the story and focused on the truth of those details instead of on the truth of the values behind them. And what I see Meldrum doing is getting too focused on those details and forgetting the values that are behind them. So when I say I value religion over science, I mean that I prioritize ethics and morality as more important than the advancement of science. As a scientist, I say this. Now, for me, what that means in practice is that I respect the religious freedom of Native Americans. They have an inherent right to review how scientists handle and study their ancestors' remains and the cultural materials they have left behind. Those materials belong to them, not to collectors, not to museums, not to anthropologists, unless we have clear and prior consent from those descendant communities. That's a religious belief of mine, or an ethical belief of mine. And according to my beliefs, scientists should not have the right to study the remains of indigenous ancestors or initiate archaeological excavations without the ethical review by and permission of descendant communities. And for me, valuing religion over science also means that I am obligated to tell the truth as I best understand it, even when that truth is uncomfortable for believers in religious narratives, such as those coming from the Book of Mormon. So let's go to some of those uncomfortable truths. How about that?
Okay.
So my constructive critique, I want to clarify before I get into that, is that my intent is to share why I, as an anthropologist, find the Heartland model less than convincing. I'm not advocating that people believe the same as me. People have the right to articulate their own beliefs and perspectives and should weigh varieties and make their own choices. Each person should find their own path to reconciling science and religion, and I value other people's perspectives even when they differ from my own. Okay, and so I'm just sharing what I've learned based upon a career in the field of anthropology and how it relates to what I see articulated in these books advocating a Heartland model. The first thing, critique that I want to offer is actually of both the Mesoamerican and the Heartland geographies. When you actually sit down and read these books, it's interesting that both limited geographies engage in a considerable contortion of landscape and disagree about geographic references in the Book of Mormon. They read the Book of Mormon quite differently in terms of its geography, yet both camps argue that the Book of Mormon provides a clear and consistent geography. Yet they can't agree on the basic details. And let me give some examples. In both models, west can mean south and east can be north. Rivers can be seas, and narrow necks need not be narrow or long. Yet both camps claim that the Book of Mormon presents a consistent and reliable internal portrait of ancient America. If this is true, then why do they so vigorously disagree on the basic landscape configurations?
Interesting.
Now I'd like to look at just a basic historical correction that needs to be made. Meldrum, in his book on DNA, implies that the X lineage was unknown in 2002 at the time of the filming of the video DNA versus the Book of Mormon. And this is just a misstatement of fact, a misunderstanding apparently on his part. Or maybe he didn't present his ideas clearly. That's possible. That this is simply not historically accurate. Investigating the X lineage is what led me to David Glenn Smith, one of the people interviewed in the DNA versus the Book of Mormon video. And he introduced me to the filmmakers, Joel Kramer and Jeremy Reyes. And so it was precisely because I was investigating the possibility that the X lineage might have been found in Mesoamerica by David Glenn Smith and his team. It turns out it wasn't, but that was the impetus that got me involved, was investigating the X lineage. I also discussed the X lineage at quite a bit of length in my essay, Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics, in this book, American Apocrypha, that I am glad to see right behind your head there. And this was published before the video came out, written before even the interviews took place, at least portions of it, and there was some editing occurred after. It's also worth noting that Miroslava Durenko, who announced the detection of the haplogroup X in Siberia in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2001, was cited in a February 2002 article in the Financial Times, stating that the X lineage was not evidence of a linkage between ancient Israelites and American Indians. And that news story that was run in the Financial Times in 2002 was the first news story to cover DNA versus the Book of Mormon. And it came out during the Olympics in Salt Lake City in 2002. But interestingly, the only US paper to run that story was the Indian Country Today, which is a Native American-owned newspaper. So that it is worth time for people to look that up and take a look at it.
And just everybody, I'm wearing my Borders t-shirt, and I used to be the periodicals director at the at that location, and I remember Indian Country. That was one of the papers we distributed. Just throw that in there.
Yeah, and Financial Times too.
Oh, I'm sure we carried Financial Times. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it's a major European newspaper.
Yeah.
On a related note, in a header on page 75 of his DNA book, Meldrum claims that the X lineage is not found in Asia. And I don't know if this was an editorial mistake, but it's simply not true. It's simply not true, even if you continue to read the text, because on the very next page, Meldrum quotes a peer-reviewed article describing the presence of the X lineage in Altayan populations of southwestern Siberia, as demonstrated by Durenko, that I just mentioned in that just talked about this in the Financial Times. And so his own text disagrees with his headline, with his header. And, it's possible that he did a little research after he had the original headings and forgot to go back and change it. So I give him the benefit of the doubt, but it's very misleading to his readers to have a false statement in a header and then have a more accurate statement below it. And that really is a shame that it made it into that book. And it's also very important to point out that the X lineage is actually quite widespread. It's found in North and Western Asia, in the Middle East, Europe, and Africa. And in fact, in your recent interview with Meldrum, he showed a map of the distribution of the X lineage that was much more accurate than his book. Okay, so it also demonstrated that his book claim was inaccurate. So his views appear to have evolved or changed over time, or at least he is recognized he made a mistake and trying to correct it now. And kudos to him for that. Now, the X lineage is much older than Meldrum claims. The separation between the sublineages found in America and those in the Middle East occurred more than 20,000 years ago. Now, it's helpful for me to step back and look at the big picture here for people that might not be familiar with the debate on DNA versus the Book of Mormon. So what scientists found, geneticists looking at Native American origins in the early research, the earliest research that was done on genetic ancestry, particularly on maternal lineages known as mitochondrial DNA, the first lineages identified were present in Native American populations. These are A, B, C, and D. These are also present in Northern, in Eastern Asian populations, these same lineages. And those lineages are key to understanding that intimate relationship between Asian populations and Native American populations. Later, the X lineage was identified, and you can kind of follow the timeline by the alphabet because they were using the alphabet to identify these lineages. And the X lineage was found in a more widespread than A through D. Okay, so it wasn't just found in Northeast Asia and North Asia, East Asia, Central Asia too. And the Americas, A, B, C, and D were limited to that range, where X was found more widespread, as I said, in Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Western Asia as well. And so the discovery of the X lineage did generate some excitement. In fact, it was announced in Salt Lake City at a genetics conference or physical anthropology conference there. And so it generated some excitement in Mormon communities, thinking maybe there was a potential connection to Middle Eastern populations. And that's a question I evaluated before I published my article on Lamanite Genesis, genealogy, and genetics. And what I found is that the timing is wrong. You know, that although there is a kinship, it's a very distant kinship between some Western Asian, European, and African populations and Native Americans, and that the genetics shows that the ancestors that carried that lineage split from each other about 20,000 years ago or more in some cases. So it's well outside of the time frame of the Book of Mormon.
I do find that interesting that, you know, I noticed, you know, when Rod gave his presentation, we're going to talk about it, is that that's why the young Earth creationist model is employed, because that then helps try to explain the dates. So I was surprised that Rod really went, this is really the first time he's ever really explicitly tied his creationist model with the Heartland model, but it seemed to be the underlying thing that was there, but it's the first time it was kind of really articulated. But that's why the time frames are important in his worldview.
Yeah, and I'm glad that he articulated that, but I have to say that it undermines his credibility in my eyes, and in I think the eyes of a lot of researchers. And you know, it would be a whole nother interview to go into the creation evolution debate. Maybe someday we can do that. I spent my career teaching evolution, as the most frequently taught class I've taught is human origins and bioanthropology, which looks at human origins from an anthropological perspective. But that would be a topic for another time. Okay. Yep. I will say at this point that Meldrum's critiques of the dating methodologies derived from creationist literature are unfounded and unconvincing. And an important point to point out is that anthropologists typically use multiple methods of dating that collectively provide compelling evidence that ancestors of American Indians have been in the Americas since time immemorial, as the elders would put it, or to put it in archaeological terms, at least 10,000 years or more before the events described in the Book of Mormon. And the more is appearing more and more likely, in part because of the genetic research and recent reconsiderations of some of the older evidence that we found in the Americas. Anthropologists, I mean, Native people have been saying for a long time, we've been here since time immemorial. And anthropologists, used to be basically like those young Earth creationists and saw everything occurring within the last few thousand years. And then over time, anthropologists have come around as the evidence accumulated and accumulated, that it had to be older and older and older and older and older. And that's that has been rapidly pushed forward by the genetic evidence, because the genetic evidence was pushing back the dating of the separation between Native Americans and Asians tens of thousands of years before archaeologists were willing to admit people were here in the Americas. And part of it was that that skepticism in anthropological circles of new evidence, and that skepticism is good. To have something well established, you can't just have one dating method. You got to have multiple dating methods. And so now many of these older sites that have been proposed on somewhat sketchier evidence, that is only one or two dating samples, for example, they're now going back and testing them with multiple methods and pushing that dating further and further back.
So just real quick, often the main creationist critique of the dating method is the carbon-14 method. Maybe
Right.
just briefly talk about those other multiple means of dating in addition to carbon-14, just so the audience gets a better understanding that carbon-14 is not the only means that they use for dating.
Yeah, I mean, there are other chemical ones such as potassium argon dating or thermoluminescence. And these are, looking at chemical compositions and how they change over time. But I think the most important one is the most basic one. And this is the one that is thoroughly problematic in the Heartland model. And this is what's called stratigraphy. Stratigraphy is when you encounter artifacts in the ground, artifacts that are closer to the top are artifacts. In almost all cases, there are some exceptions, but in almost all cases, the artifacts closer to the surface are those that were laid down most recently. And the further you dig down into at least an undisturbed site, the items will get older the further you get down. And this is the very basics of dating in archaeology. And it's one entirely massacred by Meldrum's book. Okay. And it's the most fundamental dating method to begin with. And I'll get into a little bit of detail where he misses the point there. Okay. There are a few exceptions to that. Let's say, this happened on archaeological sites where I have, you're digging down and you actually find a rodent has dug down into an area, and you can recognize that by the discoloration in the soil. And a rodent, say, penetrating into a lower area might carry something down from above to a lower level. And this is why it's really important that when you do archaeology, you're very careful and you document everything that you're doing so that you can get a good stratigraphic layering. Yeah, I'll get into that in a little more detail when I talk about one of my later criticisms. So the next one I want to articulate is that Rod Meldrum's claim that the X lineage is Caucasian or white, those are his terms, is both wrong and racist. And I don't use that word lightly, okay? And I want to explain and articulate a little why this argument is so important. The X lineage, as I've already noted, is found in North Africa, Asia, America, and Europe. It's inaccurate to associate it with whiteness. The genetic code within the X lineage does not code for skin color or any other feature typically associated with race. People carrying the X lineage come in all colors, all shapes and sizes, and represent all so-called races. It is not a Caucasian lineage. It is not a white lineage. And so that is a fundamental flaw that undermines the entire argument that Meldrum articulates in this book. It's a basic misunderstanding of genetics. And I would add that it is generally inaccurate to use racial labels for DNA lineages that cut across racial groups. Now, I should point out that Rod Meldrum is not the only one to do this. I've seen it in his cousin Jeff Meldrum's writings. It even sleeps into the church's essay in Hugo Prego's writings at times too, because it's kind of a shorthand way to say Asian DNA or Native American DNA, that if we use those terms, it's actually inaccurate, okay? And so even scientists are guilty of this at times. But Meldrum takes it to a different level, okay? And what I want to do is explain a little bit why. DNA identifies us by lineage, not by race. And I want to have a couple of stories to illustrate this. The first is an example from my bioanthropology classes and human origins classes. For over 20 years, my students have been extracting their own mitochondrial DNA, and then we extract it, we amplify it, and then we send it to a lab for sequencing. And then we take those sequences and we conduct comparisons and contrasts with each other within the class. And they also, I throw in mine so they can make comparisons with me as well. And then the students, we use some computational models, some computer algorithms to help identify the frequency of relationships, how closely related they are, kind of like using a calculator to do the math. And we have them run some comparisons with each other. Before they do that, I have them develop some hypotheses about who do you think is your closest relative in this class? Who do you think is your most distant? Okay. And the default thing that students will do is that they will use racial characteristics to make those assumptions, just because that's the society we've grown up in. We've grown to think racially. But DNA actually is one of the best refutations of racial thinking when we actually look at it in detail. And so these students, when they actually run the comparisons, and what these comparisons are telling them is who is your closest maternal relative in the class. And so mitochondrial DNA traces your mother's ancestor. And so it isn't necessarily all your relatives, okay? So that's an important factor to recognize. But who is your closest maternal relative in the class? And in every single class, for more than 20 years, some of my students have consistently found that their closest maternal relatives belong to a different race than they do. Okay?
Interesting.
And every time it's because these lineages do not follow racial categories. And in fact, my closest maternal relatives over these many, many years of doing these experiments are often students with an Asian background. And that's because my mitochondrial lineage is an ancient one that, just like X, is quite widespread across Eurasia. And so when we actually look at the DNA, it's telling a different story than our racial categories, which are actually a modern invention used to justify slavery and economic disparities. It's not a biological reality. And that's a basic teaching that we have in our introductory anthropology classes. And I should say that my bioanthropology classes are available online through Edmonds College. They fill up really quickly. So if you want to enroll, you need to do so pretty quick. But I have classes for winter quarter that are open now, and we'll have some later in spring if you want to get into this in more detail. But one of the important things we teach is that race is a social construct, not supported by a close look at human biology. Our physical features, such as our skin color, our facial structure, our hair texture, that are typically associated with race, are inherited independently of each other and cut across so-called races, just like DNA lineages. That's why, for example, you can have Australian Aborigines with black skin and blonde hair. That's why some of the most famous fossils in England, when they did the DNA, found out they had black skin. Cheddar Man from England has dark skin.
That's right.
Okay, and so our racial concepts are biased. They're based on our politics, our ways of excluding and discriminating against each other in ways that are not supported by a close look at biology. Yet we take superficial appearances and then dump people into categories based upon those. Well, people's actual biology is much more complex than that. And this is just a fundamental flaw in Meldrum's thinking.
Continue.
So differences in skin color that are the superficial ones that we focus on the most in the United States, because race isn't even understood in all cultures. Okay, it's kind of an American concept that's spread in some cultures. All cultures have amount of prejudice and ethnocentrism where they think of themselves as to some degree better than others, but it isn't always framed in biological terms. That's, again, largely an American invention. And it's focused on skin color because what happened in the immigration to America, the United States, is that you had kind of three major populations that had interacted distantly in the past, but had been largely separated from each other. And that was people from places like Africa, Europe, and the Americas. And so we had some stark differences that we could easily see between these groups. And they tended to be concentrated around skin color, okay? And so dialogue in the Americas began to focus on skin color because that became a way to figure out who was a slave or who who might have access to particular resources, that sort of thing. When we actually look at the biology of skin color, we find that it has nothing to do with religion or morality. And this is a strong refutation of the arguments in the Book of Mormon. And I should note, I wrote an article about this called Sin, Skin, and Seed, and I presented it at the John Whitmer Historical Association in 2004, their meeting right before the World Conference of the Community of Christ. And this article articulates the reasons that the science in the Book of Mormon is wrong, the science of skin color in the Book of Mormon. Basically, the Book of Mormon idea that a dark skin is a curse from God for wickedness has no biological founding, because skin color evolves in response to the environment and doesn't have anything to do with morality. Darker skin protects against skin cancer and destruction of folic acid, which is important in preventing birth defects like spina bifida. And so having darker skin, particularly in areas where there's a lot of sun, will provide protection for people living in those environments. Now, lighter skin provides protection against cold injury and aids in the processing of vitamin D from sunlight, and thus protects against rickets. And so what we have is that human populations in more temperate areas with less sun need to have more vitamin D processed to avoid rickets. And so there's a natural selection for lighter skin in those temperate climates. And this is the reason that we see lighter skin more towards the poles, and we see darker skin in more tropical regions. This happens regardless of how closely related people are. So you see that same trend in the Americas. You see that same trend in Africa and Europe. You see that same trend in Australia and Southeast Asia. And so even though Australians and Africans may be very distant from each other, or Australians and Native Americans are distant from each other, those same processes are selecting for skin color in those different environments. And I think at this point, it's worth taking a moment for an aside to respond to one of Meldrum's claims in your last interview with him, in which he said that anthropologists are racist because we say that our ancestors came from Africa. He claimed that because apes are black, that somehow we are disparaging African people by associating them with apes. Well, that's not the case, and I want to explain why. Chimpanzees, our closest living relative that share more than 98% of our DNA, they are an ape, okay? They actually have light pink skin under a dark fur coat. And so the assumption behind Meldrum's comment that apes have dark skin is actually incorrect.
Just real quick, I heard bonobos are actually related closer to us. Bonobos are actually...
It's pretty close to the same. It's in the same ballpark. There
Okay.
are some behavioral ways that bonobos appear more like us as well.
Okay.
And bonobos are a chimpanzee though. So when I say chimpanzees, I'm including
It's
bonobos.
within that group. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So they're different. They're different species. So there's the common chimpanzee and the pygmy or bonobo chimpanzee.
Okay.
And we're very close to both. And probably the bonobo is a little more like our common ancestor than the common chimp, I think. Okay. But that's hard to determine with confidence. Okay. And the reason that anthropologists point to Africa for the origins of humanity is that that's where our closest relatives are found. And that's not just among monkeys and living apes, okay, but also in the fossil record. So hundreds of fossils of species we identify as Australopithecines, Paranthropus, and Ardipithecus, all of which display characteristics, kind of a mosaic of characteristics that include human and chimpanzee-like characteristics, have been found in Africa and nowhere else. So humans separated from a common ancestor with chimpanzees around 5 to 7 million years ago. And then the fossil record shows over millions of years, our ancestors were only in Africa. It's only about 2 million years ago that our ancestors begin to be found outside of Africa with Homo erectus, that species. And so that's the reason we identify Africa, is because that's where our ancestors are. It has nothing to do with racial prejudice, okay? And in terms of DNA, we've confirmed what we see from the archaeological record, because in genetics, we find that the oldest lineages, that is the lineages that are ancestral to the ones that are found elsewhere in the world, all come from Africa. And that the most human genetic diversity in the world is found in Africa. So Africans as a population are more genetically diverse than the entire rest of the world. And that's what you would expect if our ancestors came from Africa. And just as to wrap this up, I want to say that Africans are not more ape-like than the rest of humanity. They're just as human as anybody else. And in terms of skin color, it's ironically white people who are more ape-like.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Now,
So just folks, this is it's really important that we have these kind of conversations because, there was racism in the 19th century. Basically everybody was racist. And one of the things that I don't like about creation, some of the tactics the creationists use, is they tend to use these racial things as to sully Darwin and his folk early on, because some of the early evolutionists did have racist views and actually used things like social Darwinism and thought that the races evolved from different species and stuff like that. And they're just saying, but the problem is that Christian creationists also had racist ideas at this very same time. So nobody is exempt from this dark period of history.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I was shocked by the racism in Darwin's Origin of the Species when I read it. So, it's there, and it's not what anthropologists believe today, but it is present in those early scientific writers, and as you said, also among Christians, it's underlying a lot of Meldrum's argument in the association of the three sons of Manoah with races, and that idea I deconstruct in that Sin, Skin, and Seed article as well. And I don't want to go into too much detail here, but I just refer people that are interested in it to that. Next, I want to address Meldrum's claim that an ancient white race built the mounds that are found in the Mississippi Valley, in Ohio, in New York, and in the American Southeast. That idea is both racist and unsupported by the archaeological and historical records. And it's really underlying what we called in anthropology, we call the Mound Builder myth. And we use that term myth in both the sense that it is false and in the sense that it forms a nationalist identity. It becomes an primordial truth for a nationalist identity in the United States. And it's an idea that gained popularity in the aftermath of the American Revolution. Okay, so it is closely tied with American nationalism. And the idea is that ancestors of American Indians were not intellectually capable of building sophisticated mounds and earthworks. That's the racist idea underpinning this, despite conflicting evidence at the time it was developed. It developed, though, because it helped ease the conscience of Euro-American settler colonialists who were engaged in and benefiting from genocide. They were themselves wiping out the native populations, and they needed a way to ease their own consciences over what was clearly wrong and was clearly against basic Christian teachings of the day. And I think it's interesting to read the Book of Mormon within that context. I think that Joseph Smith and many of his contemporaries were deeply troubled by the destruction of native populations, yet they were benefiting from it. And so they're trying to find a way to rationalize it, trying to justify it. And this Mound Builder myth came up at a very convenient time to do that. And people's own psychological anxiety and their desire to protect what they had taken in war, those things came together to build this crescendo of popularity around a myth that is simply untrue, that there was once an ancient white race of mound builders in the Americas that were destroyed by the ancestors of the American Indians. This idea would get incorporated into the Book of Mormon, and is why Meldrum is defending it. Well, from an archaeological perspective, there's actually no dramatic widespread wars of destruction or major economic revolutions during the Woodland period, which is 1000 BC to AD 1500. You'll see this in basic introductory textbooks to ancient North America, like that of Brian Fagan. There's just not the type of destruction that's described in the Book of Mormon did not occur in this North American region that's proposed as the Heartland Model. Yet Meldrum keeps trying to imply that happened. but there's no archaeological evidence for it. That type of widespread destruction would leave very clear distinctions in the biological record and the archaeological and linguistic record as well.
Just real quick, one of the arguments the Heartlanders make is that the Hopewell culture that they attach to the Nephite civilization roughly corresponds with the Book of Mormon time frame, and that they say that around 400 AD, the Hopewells disappear. Is that accurate?
It's false.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
So that's not true. Not at all. Not at all true. And so it's also important to recognize, though, that this myth of a mound builder race is important for settler colonial anxiety. And that's where in the Book of Mormon, the right to land is contingent upon righteousness. This idea is an anachronistic projection of settler colonial logic into an ancient past. And again, I really want to recommend Elise Boxer's article in this book of Essays on American Indian and Mormon History that explains the Book of Mormon as a settler colonial text. That this idea developed to give justification for people from Europe to take land away from people that it obviously belonged to, okay, and ethically belonged to, and by basic Christian ethics and morality, it's hard to justify. And so this is an elaborate effort to try to justify that. One of the reasons that this myth of an ancient white race is clearly wrong is that European explorers and colonists actually recorded observations of Native Americans building and visiting mounds. So they saw it. Thomas Jefferson observed it in his childhood. One of the mounds that he excavated, he saw the people coming to visit it. And he had no doubt that it was Native Americans who built it because he'd seen them working on it. He'd seen them visiting it. And, these observations kind of get lost in the narrative.
So just real quick, so you're saying there are mounds that would date to the time of Thomas Jefferson?
Yes.
Okay, and we date them.
In that case, they were continuing to be visited. And so the mounds, a lot of them accumulated over time. So there'd be burials placed on over time. And so they get bigger and bigger over time. And so this process of coming back and visiting, you might only put some new bones in there, okay, and new burials. And so it might be a small change to the mound, but this was occurring after, at the very time that this mythology was arising. Even after the American Revolution, natives were still building these mounds.
Okay, so in the mounds, we'll find that at the top layer would be dated to contemporary to that period of time of Thomas Jefferson. And as we go further down, how far down? I mean.
Well, that depends on the mounds, because not all. Yeah. So not all mounds are
right.
Were still being used.
Got it.
Yeah, there were many that were no longer being used. They might have just been being visited, though.
Got it.
And in other cases, they were being visited and additional burials were placed in them. So depends on the specific setting there.
The important thing is that the tradition of coming back and putting the bodies there would be a continuous link to the past.
Right, exactly. And that basically continued into Joseph Smith's lifetime. The woodland societies in the terms that are often used, not just by Meldrum, but also by many archaeologists, are the Adena and Hopewell. So Adena would be the early woodland, Hopewell the middle woodland. These societies did not disappear, but they evolved into Mississippian and other mound building cultures. Again, this is where, what changed at 400 AD was the frequency with which certain types of mounds were being built. Okay. And that it wasn't a widespread destruction. Okay. It was a cultural cultural evolution occurring around that time, but it wasn't the type of destruction that you see in the Book of Mormon. It was not Hopewell people being wiped out. It was not Adena people being wiped out. Okay, and so the Meldrum and his colleagues associate the Adena with the Jaredites and Hopewell with the Nephites, that can't be the case, because the Adena become the Hopewell. The descendants of the Adena are the Hopewell, and so archaeologically, what they're saying is that Nephites are descendants of Jaredites, and that's not what I read in the Book of Mormon. And so they just really misrepresent the archaeological record here. And the most important thing to point out, though, is that the descendants of mound building populations are still alive today, and they're well known to anthropologists. And highly recommend this book, Native Americans, Archaeologists in the Mounds, by Barbara Alice Mann, a Seneca descendant, who explains that the descendants of the mound builders are the Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Iroquois, the Lenape, and the Ho-Chunk, and others. These are the descendants of mound builders. They still claim to be the descendants of the mound builders, still have oral traditions related to the mound building, still visit the mounds that are important to them. This tradition is not dead. It's not a dead tradition. It's a living Native American tradition. And it's only in white nationalist fantasies that these cultures disappeared, and not in the archaeological record.
Okay. Of course, I think a more traditional or Orthodox Heartlander would say that, well, that's what we're saying, that these people are the descendants of the Lamanites. I've heard the argument made that once the time period of after Christ happened, that there was a lot of, like, there was no longer, we have references, there were no ites and stuff like that, and that the idea of Lamanite and Nephite kind of lost their distinctiveness. And so that then they had so intermingled with each other, the argument would go then, well, of course, you're going to find that intermingling, and that the idea of Lamanite Nephite was more of an idea than a racial thing at the final battle at Hill Cumorah. Would that be an argument that you would hold any water with you?
I like certain aspects of that. I mean, it is, the great piece in the Book of Mormon. I use the Iroquois term for that event because this event is in Iroquois oral tradition. It's worth pointing out. And I discuss that quite a bit in this book, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, in my essay here, about what do we learn about the great peace in Iroquois tradition. So there is this idea of the coming together of different people, so that occurs in both traditions. In the Book of Mormon, it's framed as there were no manner of ites among us. Okay, and so there is this melding of people. Now, if you follow the Book of Mormon narrative further along, you find that they do separate again into Nephites and Lamanites, and there are insinuations, not as explicit as they are in the early Book of Mormon, of the racial aspects, but they're still there. Certainly references to seed and stuff. So that idea starts to fall apart when you read the rest of the Book of Mormon. But I like it. I like that way of looking at it, and I just I would just recommend we look at it also within the context of Iroquois stories of the Great Peace. And those very well may have inspired Joseph Smith's recounting. So now to come back to my critiques of the Heartland model, one of the most fundamental problems that really created the Mesoamerican model emerged in popularity in, as I said, it had some 50s, 60s, and 70s articulations but fluoresced mostly in the 80s, and there was something really critical that happened, in the 70s, and that is that LDS archaeologists, as well as some prominent non-Mormon archaeologists such as Michael Coe, began publishing in articles on archaeology in the Book of Mormon in a new journal called Dialog. And in dialogue, they pointed out all these archaeological problems with the Book of Mormon. And so the pushing of the Mesoamerican model was in part a response to these archaeological problems. And I think it would benefit Meldrum and Neville to go back to those dialogue articles and actually read what the archaeologists are saying, because they repeat many of the same problems. And the fundamental problem is this, that the European flora, fauna, and technology mentioned in the Book of Mormon is not found in ancient America. It's not found in Mesoamerica, and it's not found in North America. And let me be very specific about this. There are no grains of Eurasian origin, such as wheat, barley, oats, flax, etc., that are found in the Americas during the time frame proposed in the Book of Mormon, despite the specific mention of some of those in the Book of Mormon itself, plus the claim that Jaredites and Nephites brought their seeds with them when they migrated, okay? Instead of those plants of European origins, Adena and Hopewell peoples cultivated indigenous species of sumpweed, of sunflower, of gourds, squashes, goosefoot, knotweed, maygrass, little barley, tobacco, nuts like acorns, fruits, and berries. And notice I did mention a barley there, okay? There is an indigenous form of barley that's found in the Americas, but it could not have come from Asia with the Jaredites or Lehites because it developed from a wild variety that was already present here in the Americas. And so they play up that barley similarity, but that's just the name that we've applied to it. It is related to the barley of the Old World, but it's a native variety that was domesticated locally here, not brought over from the ancient Near East. Now, corn is the only domesticated crop mentioned in the Book of Mormon to have originated in America. However, only sporadic occurrences of maize or corn appear in the Middle Woodland period, not at all in the Early Woodland period, okay? And it was not until the rise of Mississippian culture centuries after the events of the Book of Mormon that corn and beans would become widespread in Meldrum's proposed geography. So his playing up of corn really kind of misrepresents the archaeological record. It's only sporadically found and not widely used at that time. And so again, inconsistent with the Book of Mormon narrative. It's also important to point out that indigenous cultivation of the Adena and Hopewell and other Mississippian native cultures was female-based and used digging sticks and native plants rather than plows, livestock, and domesticated plants from Europe. That type of agriculture is not found in ancient America. And in fact, no domesticated livestock of Eurasian origin, and that would include things like horse, cattle, oxen, sheep, goats, chickens, etc., are found in the Americas during the time frame proposed in the Book of Mormon. Again, despite the fact that the Book of Mormon claims that the Jaredites and Nephites brought these with them. And they also say they found some here. The Adena and Hopewell peoples, instead of using European animals, ate migratory waterfowl, deer, raccoon, turkey, shellfish, and even dogs. No European technology such as chariots, steel, plows, linen, silk, and glass is found in Adena or Hopewell cultures. So again, we find that the technology of the Book of Mormon is wrong for ancient America. And I'm going to come back to some important points from this, but I want to point out another really important critique first. And that is this ornate picture book. Unfortunately, features frauds, fakes, and images of features and mounds from outside of the Book of Mormon period, despite the fact that one of their critiques of the Mesoamerican model is the tendency of Mesoamericanists to use pictures of classic Maya architecture. Well, they do the same with Mississippian. Okay. So let me mention a few specifics here. The Newark Holy Stones, the Bat Creek Stone, and the elephant pipes that they mention are all well-known frauds, long ago discredited by professional archaeologists. The Newark Holy Stones that they mentioned that had supposedly some Hebrew inscriptions on them are based upon anachronistic Hebrew scripts taken from the wrong time. And in fact, the first one, when that was pointed out, they came back with one that was a little closer. But in both cases, they found another one, that was more what you might expect.
Is the Newark Holy Stone the one that's in Ohio, in the museum in Ohio? Is that
I think so.
It has the carving of Moses or an image of Moses or something on it, or Noah? Is that? There's the Ohio Decalogue Stone. I think I'm mixing it up with that one. Okay.
Well, this is called Decalogue Stone as well. So
okay,
I think it might be at the same one, but it's got basic anachronistic Hebrew scripts. And here's the challenge that Meldrum and his team have, is that any reader with access to the internet, all they got to do is Google this, and Wikipedia is going to give you a more accurate description than Meldrum. And so, that's a challenge in today's world, right? Perpetuating these frauds. The Bat Creek Stone that he also uses has inscriptions that are copied from an 1870 Masonic publication and includes the same errors made by that author. It was supposedly found with brass bracelets that have been identified as of late 18th or early 19th century European manufacture.
So I just have a quick question about the Bat Creek Stone. I have read that there are some non-LDS individuals who do think there might be something to it, including, I think a lot of people would probably mention Scott Wolter, who's a geologist out of Minnesota, thinks that it might be authentic. Do you have anything to say to that?
Well, it's important that none of these were LDS fabrications. Okay,
right, that's true.
So these are frauds that feed into this larger belief in an ancient white race and connections to the ancient Near East. So these ideas are not unique to Mormons, and that they didn't come from Mormons. I mean, there are some examples associated with Mormonism. I'm blanking on the name.
Talking about the Michigan relics, or
well, those have some connections to Mormons because the church bought
them, right?
But I was thinking of the one that they brought to the
Kinderhook plates.
Kinderhook plates, yeah, the Kinderhook plates that were brought to Joseph Smith. So there is a fraud that has a connection to the church, but it was intended kind of to dupe Mormons and to display Joseph Smith himself as a fraud. But so these are not unique to Mormons, and there are non-Mormons who advocate them. In fact, that probably as many or more non-Mormons as Mormons. But it's important to point out in a Mormon context that using these known frauds is the equivalent of a Mormon historian writing a book that prominently features well-known Mark Hoffman forgeries like the Salamander Letter and the Joseph Smith III Blessing. And if you came to the Mormon History Association and tried to present a paper like that first, it probably would be rejected unless you managed to sneak it in there, right? And are you surprised that it would be rejected by peer review because it's based upon Hoffman's forgeries? People that are in the know immediately that that's a fraud. And that's essentially what Meldrum is trying to push off on his audience. And it is disrespectful to his audience, for one. And it sets himself and his advocates up for disappointment when their readers just Google the Newark Holy Stones, or when their readers take an archaeology class. So I think it's really counterproductive for Meldrum to use these frauds and forgeries. And the sad thing is, though, if he wants to make any claims, he's almost dependent on them because there are no accurate. nothing coming from the accurate historical and archaeological record. I'll point out another example too. The elephant mound that he makes a big deal out of is just a bear effigy eroded by drifting sand, and well recognized as such by anthropologists.
Where's this mound located at, offhand?
I think it's another one in Ohio, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that, you know, the elephants that appear in the Book of Mormon were part of a much larger narrative among this mound builder myth, because Macedon bones were being found. So the mound builder myth includes this idea that this ancient white race had domesticated elephants. And so that makes its way into the Book of Mormon, especially through the Jaredite narrative. But that's a well-known narrative that pre-existed the Book of Mormon, and you know, and then again is being advocated by these non-Mormons because it exists independent of the Book of Mormon. And another kind of deceptive aspect of the Heartland model is that it relies upon outdated and disreputable sources. And I want to name these: E.G. Squire, Arlington Mallory, and William Connor, for their claims of European technologies like steel, and for animals like elephants and horses in Adena and Hopewell cultures. These sources do not employ modern or even stratigraphic dating methods. So now is where I want to come back to that stratigraphic aspect. So because mounds were still being built, earthworks were still being built well into the historic period, European technology was being incorporated by indigenous cultures for 200 years before the rise of this mound builder myth. Okay, so you do see in some cases European items of European manufacture found in Native American features, like even mounds. And this is particularly true and well documented in the Ganargua Valley, where Joseph Smith used to go fishing and used to do some of his treasure hunting. There was a mixture of European artifacts. In fact, there was a large 17th century battle at Ganondagan, which is a Seneca village less than a dozen miles from Palmyra and Hill Cumorah, where a significant amount of evidence of European warfare and native artifacts are all mixed together. And so if you don't employ basic dating methods like stratigraphy, it's easy to confuse these items of European manufacture with native materials. And I think that's what Joseph Smith must have done himself, is that he probably encountered in his treasure hunting and in stories he heard from others that these European items were being found with native items. And so that is part of fostering this myth of an ancient white race that comes out of basically not understanding the basic stratigraphy of an archaeological site. And when stratigraphy and other dating methods are applied, none of these items come from an ancient context. And I'll point out also that the Monk's Mound from Cahokia, which is in East St. Louis, featured on pages 114 to 117 of the photographic book of Meldrums, was built centuries after the events of the Book of Mormon. I will give him credit that in his small print, he acknowledges this fact. But I pointed out because he and Neville are so critical of the Mesoamerican model for using classic Maya features, but they're doing the same thing they're criticizing the Mesoamericans of doing. And so I think that that's a little deceptive. Now, I want to explore in my next critique something I really like about Neville's work, is that his connections to Jonathan Edwards. And I want to say The argument is this, that Jonathan Edwards' neophytes bear a striking resemblance to Joseph Smith's Nephites. Now, wait a minute, what do I mean by neophytes?
Yes.
Okay, have you heard that term, neophyte?
Oh, I've heard the term, yeah, but
Yeah.
That's
So it's a term used by these missionaries of that time period,
Yeah.
and still used today, for like a new convert to a religion. Like native converts to Christianity were often called neophytes. So there's an interesting play on words here, and what I want to argue is that the neophytes and Nephites are very similar. If Neville takes a closer look at Jonathan Edwards' missionary work, he's going to find that Christian missionaries of the 18th and 19th century sought to civilize American Indians as well as Christianize them. And that civilization meant the adoption of a male-based plow agriculture with domestic livestock, blacksmiths, wagons, wheat, barley, oats, flax, etc. This was meant to replace an indigenous agriculture that managed largely by women using digging sticks and focused on corn, beans, squash, sunflowers, and other plants. That an integral part of Christian missionary work was the incorporation of European plants, animals, and technology. And so what we've got is an anachronistic element of 18th and 19th century Christian missionary work projected back into the ancient past. And so Joseph Smith didn't just adopt Jonathan Edwards' language, he also adopted his cultural assumptions and prejudices. Neither of them could imagine indigenous civilization without European plants, animals, and technology. And so in this sense, I would say that Neville and Meldrum got the North American setting of the Book of Mormon right. They just have it in the wrong time. So I think the best parallel for Nephites are 18th and 19th century neophytes. And I want to give some very specific examples. Jonathan Edwards, in his missionary work at Stockbridge, creates a praying town. There are a number of other preachers, some native, some non-native, that were involved in similar work. Samson Occam, Samuel Kirkland, Ethan Smith, author of View of the Hebrews, Joseph Johnson, David Brown, William Apis. These are examples of neophyte communities that resemble Nephites of the Book of Mormon. And not only does the missionary program of these neophytes resemble that of the Book of Mormon, but they also use similar sermon styles, including parallel structures like chiasmus and the laying down of heads. And for those who haven't heard of that term, laying down the heads, this is a technique recently documented in the Book of Mormon by William Davis in his excellent new book, Visions in a Seer Stone.
Yeah, I'll be having him on soon.
Yeah, that'll be a good interview.
Yeah.
So another criticism I have is that the Firm Foundation, especially in their name, the Foundation for Indigenous Research in Mormonism, misrepresents themselves as conducting indigenous research. Meldrum provides no evidence that he has consulted with the cultural resource departments or the institutional review boards of federally recognized tribes from the regions he claims as part of the Book of Mormon geography. This is what indigenous researchers do. It's part of our basic ethics. This is most important to do when conducting archaeological excavations, like the one they did in 2015, looking for remains of a Zarahemla temple across the river from Nauvoo, Illinois, that was apparently unsuccessful because they took all the pictures down off their website. Going in with a bulldozer and doing an archaeological project without consulting with the local tribes is a deeply offensive ethical violation, and is not what someone calling themselves an indigenous researcher should be doing. Further, Meldrum fails to engage with indigenous oral histories and professional scholarship about mounds. He needs to engage, for example, the book I mentioned earlier by Barbara Alice Mann, Native Americans, Archaeologists, and the Mounds. That's what an indigenous researcher would do. Meldrum's work also celebrates and uncritically uses the work of notorious looters like Mallory and Connor. In fact, most of the items featured in his book appear to be looted, taken without the consent of indigenous descendants.
Who are Mallory and Connor?
They are some of those outdated sources that they use that are arguing for iron, for example, in the mounds.
Got it.
They don't obey basic stratigraphy. They were basically looting these mounds without a basic understanding of archaeology. And these are the sources he's using, which is, whoa, is like, way out there. And perhaps the most troubling thing in the entire book to me on an ethical respect is that Meldrum even proudly boasts on page 158 that he owns many copper artifacts that were likely looted from indigenous graves. Now, from an indigenous perspective, this makes Meldrum complicit in grave robbery, even if he paid for those items. And I'd like to issue a challenge to him. Would he consider returning those items? And I think if he would, it might help him engage Native communities in some genuine dialogue. And I think there'd be a lot to learn and a lot that Book of Mormon studies could benefit from engaging in repatriation of the items that have been stolen by us or someone else. Also, Meldrum features pictures of human remains on pages 162, 172, and 174 of his photography book. These images flaunt indigenous objections to such public displays of their ancestors. This is not the type of scholarship that would qualify as indigenous research at any of today's tribes, colleges, or universities with which I have worked.
Pretty strong stuff here, Thomas.
Yeah, I know it's hard to hear, but I think, from somebody who spent a career working with tribal communities, these are the sorts of things that tribal communities are criticizing people for. And it's hard to hear, and it may be surprising to Meldrum and Neville, but I think they need to take these arguments seriously, because this is the future of our work in Book of Mormon studies is going to require a more deep engagement with indigenous communities. Now, I would say that when the poor quality of Meldrum's work in the area of my expertise, which is anthropology, makes me quite suspicious of his and Dean Sessions' claims about a universal model. And I don't have the time to go into all of that here, but if the Heartland group wants the scientific community to take them seriously, then they need to begin to apply some basic ethical standards to their research. Stop promoting known frauds, stop looting archaeological sites, stop pandering to racial prejudice and white nationalism of their audiences. That would be a good first step in engaging in dialogue with the scientific community. And I want to make my final critique. I want to speak more religiously than scientifically.
Okay. Just one last thing too. You had said earlier that it's racist. And I want to make it clear. I think what you're saying is Rod Meldrum isn't necessarily a racist, that he is spouting views that he is unaware of being racist. Would that be a better way of putting it?
I think that's the way I framed it.
Okay, yeah. I just want to clarify.
Listen to what I'm saying carefully. I chose my words very carefully.
Yeah, I believe.
The arguments that Meldrum has made are racist. That's what I've said.
Exactly. I think that's good that we have that clarification. Yeah. That's good. Yeah. All right.
And the Heartland model that I've reviewed does not live up to the basic morals and ethics I learned growing up as a Mormon and as a Christian. I learned to value truth, honesty, and integrity. The use of fraudulent materials, the misrepresentations of the archaeological record, the inaccurate portrayals of science, the blaming the ancestors of Native Americans for an ancient Holocaust that never occurred, and the firm foundation's pretense of indigenous research do not live up to the moral standards of honesty and integrity. I also learned from the Book of Mormon that all are alike unto God. The looting of indigenous artifacts, the desecration of indigenous graves, the inappropriate display of photographs of the deceased, the perpetuation of racist ideas from the Book of Mormon, association of skin color with curses, the racialization of genetics, and the white nationalism of Heartlanders do not live up to that Mormon and Christian teaching that all are the same in the Creator's eyes. People who call themselves saints and Christians need to do better. Ironically, we need to do what the LDS essay on DNA in the Book of Mormon advises: prioritize the Book of Mormon's spiritual claims over its historical ones.
Wow, that's a good statement there. I think it's interesting. I think this is a good way of us starting the dialogue, starting the conversation in a civil way. And it's important that our audience hears the full spectrum and hears, Rod gave his perspective, and I'll have Rod back on to come, to talk about other things as well if he wants to discuss what we've discussed today. I know he's planning on going on Mormon stories. And so he'll also have an opportunity to give his voice in that venue as well. So here, let's talk a little bit more, because you had hinted to it earlier in our conversation, which is the idea of maybe making a contribution to the working hypothesis. Oh, what did Jonathan call it? I'm sorry.
Alternative working hypothesis.
Alternative working hypothesis. Yeah, which I think is a really good way of looking at it. And I think this is your proposal that you would like to give as well.
Yeah, and so I'm working on this in a book manuscript, and I've presented portions of it at some Sunstone conferences. And
so this is really the first time people are going to hear this.
Yeah, portions of it are in here, but I'm going in a lot more depth to some things that I think your audience will find quite interesting. And so what I'm proposing is what we might call a neophyte interpretive model for the Book of Mormon. And again, I started to articulate that in my critique. And that is that the neophytes of Jonathan Edwards' age and the Nephites of the Book of Mormon show a striking similarity. And so I'm arguing that we need to read the Book of Mormon within the 18th and 19th century as a product of that time and place, and look for not dig up graves, not continue. We don't even need to do any more archaeological research for this, but look for Nephites among the neophytes of the 18th and 19th century. And that's what I'm engaged in doing. And I found some amazing things, some really surprising things, I have to say. And I'm going to give a hint of a few of them. One of the most striking is that many of the characters and the events in the Book of Mormon resemble those found in neophyte communities, sometimes even with similar and same names, and often with a lot of detail. Now, some of these aren't perfect matches. There are some differences. And in my approach, I think the differences are equally important as the similarities, because the differences provide us a way of looking at the Book of Mormon from an indigenous perspective, because the value of this approach is that those neophyte communities left a lot of records. Those records include the diaries and journals of the missionaries, some native, some non-native, and books that were written by people like William Apis, for example, and publications by people like Samson Occam, and diaries and journals of John Johnson. These are Joseph Johnson, excuse me. And these are people that we can read in their own words. And that's something that we can't do with the ancient Nephites. But if we look at the neophyte communities, we can hear native Christians in their own words. And so here are a few things I want to highlight. One, Samson Occam, a Mohegan preacher, bears a striking resemblance to Samuel the Lamanite in what he preaches, and even in the name Samuel and Samson. This has been pointed out by many other researchers, I should note. And my colleague Angela Baca sees similarities also in William Apis, a Pequot minister and neophyte. The King Noah in the Book of Mormon resembles the Jewish leader Mordecai Noah, who attempted to establish a Jewish Indian colony in Seneca territory, not far from the home of Joseph Smith. And if you read the newspaper reports and put those along at that time that Joseph Smith would have himself probably read, and put that alongside the Book of Mormon accounts of King Noah, all of a sudden you get this wow effect of the connection.
Hmm.
Kings Benjamin and Mosiah in the Book of Mormon resemble the famous Mohican dynasty of the three Benjamins and Isaiah Uncas. And these were well known at the time and provide a parallel to the Book of Mormon dynastical treatment that, again, when you look at what was known in the 19th century about the Uncas dynasty and Benjamin Uncas in particular, and Isaiah, you start to see some of the same tensions being played out in the Book of Mormon narrative. And the place name of Oneida in the Book of Mormon resembles the most famous of all neophyte communities, that of the Iroquois nation of the Oneida. In fact, the spellings used in the Book of Mormon are one of the spellings that was common in 19th century documents. And this should be especially interesting to Jonathan Neville, because Jonathan Edwards sent his son to live with the Oneida in 1755 to 1756. Now, Jonathan Edwards' son stayed with an Irishman by the name of Sir William Johnson. Now, Sir William Johnson became a Mohawk sachem, or part of the elected council for the Iroquois Confederacy. And he bears a striking resemblance to Amalickiah, a Nephite who becomes a Lamanite king in the Book of Mormon. And it isn't just the similarities between Amalickiah and Sir William Johnson, it's that the people associated with them are also similar to Book of Mormon characters. So not only does Sir William Johnson resemble Amalickiah, but his Mohawk wife, Molly Brant, is much like the Lamanite queen he marries. And her brother, Joseph Brant, and Amaron, the Book of Mormon character, were both military successors of Johnson and Amalickiah, leading people who were called kingmen. In the Book of Mormon is what I would call allegorical reworking of the American Revolution. And so we see characters in these neophyte communities that resemble those in the Book of Mormon. And it's not just individuals, it's also the big picture communities. So there were 7 communities of neophytes who, just like the 7 Lamanite towns in the Book of Mormon, that would become the anti-Nephi Lehis, or the people of Ammon, they buried their weapons of war, a very common Iroquois practice, and came together to seek refuge with the Oneida in the newly found towns of Brotherton and New Stockbridge. New Stockbridge was founded by some of those people that Jonathan Edwards had converted to their children and grandchildren anyway. So again, there's this fascinating Jonathan Edwards connection that I would encourage Neville to take a closer look at. Even the slaughter of the pacifist anti-Nephi Lehis in the Book of Mormon resembles the experience of a neophyte community of Delaware Mohicans at Noddenhooten in 1782. Now, this one in particular, there are a lot of, there are similarities, but there are a lot of differences with this one. And those differences I'm articulating as well in my book, and I don't have time to go into here. But I will note that they're quite informative and that they actually expose some of the biases and prejudices of Joseph Smith in his role of dictating the Book of Mormon. Well, all these different historical people who coincidentally resemble characters in the Book of Mormon were connected with 3 generations of the Smith family through Moore's Indian Charity School and Dartmouth College, both created by Eliezer Wheelock as a training program for missionaries to the Indians. It's kind of the hub, if you will, of neophyte communities of the 18th and 19th centuries. And the Smith family was directly involved. So John Smith, a cousin of Joseph Sr., was the first professor and pastor there. And other research, I should note, have pointed out a lot of similarity between Mormon theology and his sermons. Hiram, Joseph Jr.'s brother, was a student amidst these neophytes and their missionaries in training. And some of these individuals, like Jacob Jameson, not only was he in school with Hiram at Moore's Charity School, but when the Smith family moved to New York, Jacob Jameson also went to New York as well. And so there's some interesting connections that we need to dig into a little bit deeper. Hmm. And now my key point in just, providing some teasers, if you will, from my as yet much of it unpublished research on the Book of Mormon, is that we can find a better match for the Nephites of the Book of Mormon among 18th and 19th century neophytes than in the archaeology of ancient America.
Wow. Well, Thomas, this is really an honor that you're giving, basically hinting towards the original research that you're doing. Also, it's multiple working hypotheses is what he called it. We were having struggling with that, and so this is basically one of your hypotheses that you're submitting. And actually, I think Jonathan's going to really appreciate this. I think I think he'll be really pleased that there are people in the scholarly community that are taking his work and his ideas seriously. And I think it's good that we have these conversations. This being a Mormon Book Reviews show, and we like to talk about books, I know that you have some books that you would like to kind of recommend for further reading. Maybe you could talk about those.
Yeah, I will. And I've mentioned a couple of them already, so I will make the first part brief. I highly recommend Barbara Allison Mann's work, a Seneca descendant, on mound builders and Native Americans. I've recommended P. Jane Hafen and Brendan Rensink's essays on American Indian and Mormon history. And it's important to point out that this was based on a seminar that occurred at BYU that included me as a participant. I think one of the most important books on the Book of Mormon. It's not on the Book of Mormon, it's about Native experiences, but 3 chapters really key in on the Book of Mormon. And I think those need to be considered in these discussions. For those that want to know a little bit more about anthropological perspectives on mound builders, I highly recommend this relatively new book, The Mound Builder Myth, Fake History and the Hunt for a Lost White Race. This will show Mormon arguments within the larger context of those frauds and forgeries and stuff that I was talking about. And then those for more of an academic perspective, more of a decolonizing perspective, that is indigenous research methodologies. I need to look at this book, Edward Watts, Colonizing the Past, Myth-Making and Pre-Columbian Whites in 19th Century American Writing. And again, this places the Book of Mormon within a larger context, and particularly the role that why it is that settler colonists needed to create this myth to justify their expropriation of the taking of native lands and resources.
We've talked about this briefly off camera. You've taken a faith journey. We talked about your faith journey that you took. Of course, you've talked on other podcasts about, your faith journey within Mormonism. And you talked on my program about your faith journey in regards to your engagement with evangelicalism and everything like that. Would you mind just talking a little bit about your personal faith, where you're at now in that journey?
I've had times in my life where I've struggled with religion in general. I've been enthralled with it. I've been repelled by it. And some of that I discussed in the last time, but I didn't really kind of bring it up to date. So, in the time since that video came out, DNA versus the Book of Mormon, and actually some of this started before then, so it was around the same time. But I took on a role at Edmonds Community College, now Edmonds College, as an anthropology instructor, and I came into what had been a thriving relationship between Indian Heritage High School in Seattle and Edmonds Community College, and hosting an annual powwow tradition. This was a celebration of Native music, arts and crafts, and dance. The students pretty quickly looked to me, because one of my predecessors had played a key role in this support of this work. It came to me to help sustain this tradition of powwows, which I've now done for over 20 years. And I worked at times as the advisor for our Native American Student Association. It's gone by a number of different names over the years. But this involved, included a lot of intimate work with Native students. And that included a lot of invitations to important events in my Native students' lives and their families, and often involving ceremony and religious components. Although I should say that Native people don't always describe these ceremonies as religious. That's a term that's kind of a Western European term. But I now, over 20 years of invited participation in Native communities, often in settings that I'm the only predominantly settler person there. I've gained a deep respect for indigenous traditions, and particularly for the openness that I would call it an inclusive religiosity rather than the exclusivity we see in some versions of Mormonism and Christianity, where we have the one and only true way. In sweat lodges or in pipe ceremonies, I often been right alongside Native Mormons and Native Christians and people who might describe themselves as atheists or who only do Native traditional practices. The whole spectrum working together within a sacred and ceremonial setting. And that has just had a profound impact on my view and really helped open up my approach today, which is a very inclusive approach to different religious traditions. And that's why I say, I think I see scriptures and sacred narratives as a means to an end. And that end is, to be more ethical, to care and love for each other, to help those in need. Those are universal values that are found in almost every religious tradition. And I hold those very close and deep in my heart.
I just saw the way you interacted with your wife when you were at the Mormon History Association, and I was telling Rod that I saw Christ-like attributes in you, and I really, that's the word that came to my mind when I saw you. Just so you know, and I told Rod that, and I just want people to understand that, especially within, my entering into the Mormon world, I have found that there's so many silos and bubbles, and people just, there's a lot of look, I can talk to somebody and say, hey, what do you think of that African model for the location of the Book of Mormon? And they'll be like, yeah, it's kind of funny, an interesting theory, yeah, whatever. Or Baja, California, or Malaysia, the Malay Peninsula theory, right? And they'll be like, that's fine. And then the second you bring up Heartland, they get, they just get very intense and no, I don't want to have anything to do that. They're just all crazy. And I'm just thinking to myself, that's what it's come down to. And the academic community and the Heartlanders, we need to all just realize that we're not the enemy. We're all image bearers, as I talked with Rod about. We're all image bearers. Let's remind ourselves of that. And I think the most important thing that I think could come of these interviews is that you having lunch with Rod Meldrum. I think
that would be fun.
And I hope that happens. I hope that this conversation helps facilitate that kind of dialogue.
I will, because you mentioned my wife, I should note that today is the 3-year anniversary of the day she did not wake up. And was in a coma for 3 days following that. And, so it's, I just wanted to mention that that kind of weigh in very heavily on me. She ended up having a severe brainstem stroke at a young age, and it dramatically changed our lives. Luckily she came out of the coma, but she had to relearn everything, like swallowing, sitting up, and walking and talking, even finding words. And being able to even remember, she has no memory of that time period in her life. And, you know, I learned a lot through that experience. You know, my wife had been the person who really taught me how to love. So that helped. I tried to put the lessons she taught me into action, but it was never easy. It was definitely a challenge. And I found times where I had to learn patience that I didn't think I had. And it's been a truly profound, transformative aspect of my life, through which we've grown much closer to each other than we ever were before. We'd never wished this thing had happened or wish it upon anybody else, but it has turned into an incredible growth opportunity for us.
I could see it. I witnessed that. That made an impression on me. You know, and just want to let you know, it was, you blessed me. Just saw the way I saw how she was there for you and you were there for her, and I really appreciated that. So Thomas, I really appreciate you taking your time to put together these fantastic presentations. I think this will be part of a continuing conversation, because I think you have so much to contribute to the conversation. I just wondered if you had any final words or last words that you would like to say to all my audience, but also to Rod and other Heartlanders.
Well, I'm sorry that I went on so long.
Okay.
I had anticipated not being quite this long, but I did it again. So that's my final word.
It's so good.
Sorry that I spoke too much.
Well, I appreciate you coming on, Thomas, and thank you so much for doing this. And yeah, but like I tell you, I said I'll sit down and watch a 5-hour presentation on Mormon stories with a scholar. So I know that's what my audience does. That's what I do. So I think they're probably still waiting. No, don't end it now. We just got started. So either way, I just want to remind my audience to like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification button to be informed when a new video comes out. Folks, we're entering into the holiday season. I just want to say, just be safe out there, use common sense, and we're going to get through this pandemic together, and you have yourself a great day.